that I should do that. I said that, yeah, the recording will be available within a week on Ollie's website. Would everyone please remain on mute? After the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. This evening, we'll hear from Dave Dabertin of the United Citizens Association. He's a Hammond attorney and an honorary member of the Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative. Dave?
Well, thank you for having me. Just so I got the ground rules right, Mike, you said about a half an hour and then we'll do questions and answers. And you know, a half an hour for me will go very quickly. And I would also like to announce that those of you who don't know, December 21st, 7 o'clock at the Lost Marsh Golf Course, we're going to do the winter walk. Mike puts that in my biography. I've told him he can winnow down that biography he keeps sending out. He's got all kinds of stuff that I'm not certain why it's on there, but so let's start with what Mike asked me to talk about. He asked me to talk about water issues near and surrounding Wolf Lake. He and I have had some involvement with that. And I told him, well, I think the way I would approach this is first, let's talk about the watershed and what we're really dealing with, and take a look at maybe a little bit of the history, because that's very important as to why those water resources are either protected or not protected. And then the Clean Water Act, which is what we're really talking about, and that Clean Water Act as delegated to the state of Indiana, and maybe give citizens a framework as to how your water is protected, and not your drinking water, which is a separate statute, how your water is protected, that is natural bodies of water. And then talk a little bit about some of the local facilities, some recent developments. And I know Mike wants me always to dig in and talk about the nitty-gritty on some of these. I'd rather not. You know, every time I seem to file a notice, I get a letter from the 300+ member law firm telling me that, you know, they're on the other side. And I just don't need any more of those letters right now, Mike, if you don't mind. So I thought we would start. And again, my graphics are not very good. I apologize to Mike. I'm not very swift at getting things online or on camera. But I wanted to start with this picture. And I think you can all see this. This is where you really have to start when you talk about our watershed. If you can look at this, this is Wolf Lake here. This is George Lake. Look at the size of that lake. And this is Berry Lake. Berry Lake is really, they start to fill in Berry Lake as soon as the refinery gets here, 1889. It's gone. It's now the Berry Lake, either tank field or unit or something. It's kind of a strange way to memorialize a natural body of water that was destroyed completely and wholly. I also think when we talk about watersheds and we talk about what these watersheds used to be, is you understand that the view towards this area, which was primarily swamp, which was primarily, we had some dune and swale, but something close to that. The goal was that this was wasteland, and that the community near Wolf Lake, near George Lake, near Berry Lake were all considered to be not suitable for agriculture. And so they really didn't have much purpose. And so settlement of the United States kind of skips over Northwest Indiana because it is simply swamp and these shallow lakes. And we can talk about, if you wanted to see, this is where the tangents go, Mike. This is where I get off kilter. But the lakes are formed they're very shallow. And so they're really viewed as not much good for anything. So when the first development comes in, which is primarily industrial development, the destruction of these lakes should be wholly and completely. That is people who are concerned about these bodies of water, primarily Wolf Lake and George Lake, have had an uphill battle for as long as I know. Someone always has an idea about coming in to fill them in, whether it was the airport from the 1920s, the airport from the third Chicago airport they were going to build. George Lake is filled in. It's kind of a crazy story. And again, I won't get too much into the history here, but I'll tell you where it's important, which is that George Lake is filled in, if I can show, to about there. I mean, George Lake at one time existed all the way south of 141st, pretty close to Gosselin and Hammond. And you can see the width of that lake, much, much larger than you would expect it. What we see today is just that little tip that's left, and then the bottom down here where the canal has been dredged through it. So the approach on these lakes is destroy them, and destroy them completely and as fast as you can. There have been some recent developments now that maybe would protect these lakes, but primarily they were just viewed as things that should be destroyed. George Lake is almost destroyed until the 1970s. Late 1970s, Calumet College tries to put the final death knell to the lake. What you see now was preserved. The South Basin was essentially destroyed by the golf course, despite promises to do otherwise. It's a nice deep hole filled with golf balls, but I think its natural value has been diminished greatly by dredging it. So what you really have is that north section. Wolf Lake, I don't think there's any elevation in Wolf Lake that hasn't been changed. Wolf Lake, again, is slated for destruction. It is saved in the 1930s by citizens. It's a very interesting story. Again, we won't go into all of it, but I find it fascinating that, you know, the state of Indiana at that point came in. When George Lake was being filled, I should point out, in the 1920s, the state of Indiana came forward and said, no, that's a natural body of water. You can't just fill it in. Hammond wants to fill it in to create a steel mill, which they never get, which is why that property is known as the J&L property. It's because it was Jones and Laughlin Steel that had proposed to put a steel mill there. Hammond, being Hammond, not having any real heavy industry, being broke compared to what the other cities had, wants that steel mill in the worst way. So they fill in essentially the southern reaches of George Lake as fast as they can with steel mill waste. I mean, the thing is just, I mean, they describe it as being, you know, 24-hour-a-day trucks coming out of the steel mill to fill it in. It's later filled in on top of that with a lot of chemical waste that comes from Amoco. Wolf Lake, on the other hand, they try to stop. Everyone says, well, let's save it. You know, it's our last lake. The 1930s, there is a tax that goes out throughout the state of Indiana. But when it comes time to buy the lake, the state of Indiana absolutely refuses to use the money set aside to purchase Wolf Lake, to preserve it as a state park, and decides to give those funds to, there's these called land barons along the Kankakee River who purchased a lot of wet property that they can't do anything with. So the state bails out those people against the people from Northwest Indiana who want to save Wolf Lake. Wolf Lake is actually saved by its name. Very clever citizens get together. Wolf Lake's correct name is Wolf Lake Memorial Park. It's dedicated to the war dead. So they would go to these meetings in the early 1950s, late 40s and say, this is a lake dedicated to the war dead. How dare you diminish it? So finally, the state of Indiana gives in, but they give in with a caveat. They're not going to make it a state park. The city of Hammond can have the property as long as they keep it as a park. There was a state statute that was actually withdrawn. It should have stayed there. And Wolf Lake essentially is going to be left, but there's absolutely no money left to develop it or to preserve it. That's why we get the Indiana Toll Road. The Indiana Toll Road comes through and says, you know, we want to put our road through Wolf Lake in the early 1950s, but as sort of a deal with the devil, if you will allow us to remove all this sand, we'll help you develop it. And that's how, like, you get the island. Hopefully everybody knows the island in Wolf Lake is made with garbage. It's not a very nice island. If you go out there, you'll see all the broken glass and the garbage that was dumped there. That was actually a parking lot for the racetrack that was there. And they just left it not by creating an island, but by not excavating that. Until the Corps of Engineers did their project a few years ago, the lake was an uneven depths. It still has a road through the middle of it. Those of you who sail know that when you hit that road, you'll realize that Wolf Lake was really never treated the way it should have been. But that's the deal with the devil, and that's how we get to the Wolf Lake that we have today. So that's the watershed. And I always tell people, when you think of the lake, the George Lake and the Wolf Lake watershed, you have to, in my mind, you have to take the approach that all of this property is still a lake. It's just been filled. That gets to an interpretation of something I wanted to talk about under the public trust doctrine. The idea that these lakes are not held by any individual entity, but they are held in trust. Every other lake in the state of Indiana that is natural or navigable is held in trust, that is held on behalf of the public. It's not something that can be destroyed without, well, really, it's a very, very tough hurdle to overcome. And again, I'm looking at my time. I'm going to get on another tangent, which is the Gunderson decision. Those of you who are familiar know that the Indiana Supreme Court finally, with every other state, I think, in the union having recognized that certain bodies of water are so important that no one can own them, that they are owned in public trust. That is, they are owned by the public, not by any individual that can just go out and destroy them. The seminal decision is the Gunderson decision from the Indiana Supreme Court, which deals primarily deals completely with Lake Michigan, but they do a wonderful analysis as to how these navigable waters should be treated. This map does not show it, but hopefully everyone, again, sorry, my graphics are not very good. I can't even tell if it's backwards, but everyone knows that at one time Wolf Lake connected into Lake Michigan. There's quite the ice. There's actually a pier over there still, right off the Hammond Marina. This was for the ice companies. They would actually, Wolf Lake was so shallow, they would actually pump it full of water to get it raised the level so they could cut ice. And then George Lake had an entrance onto Lake Michigan as well. George Lake's entrance was Atchison Avenue. Why is that important? Well, those of you who know, that's the dividing line between Hammond and Whiting. And the reason it is because you got to this ditch, where I don't think I'd call it a river, but it's an entranceway to Lake Michigan, and it was wet, and so that was a good place to stop. I wish they had kept going, but the people from Whiting and Hammond divided on that natural barrier. And I should also point out that just something interesting. Those of you who don't know, Sheffield Avenue would come here. Calumet Avenue is built much later. It's dredged. The division between the lakes is Sheffield. So if you're trying to figure out where that line is, that's Sheffield Avenue. Sheffield Avenue is an original sand ridge. And it's an original Indian pathway, if you will. So that's the real dividing between the lakes. Calumet Avenue is on a north-south axis, and it's created by excavation. So Calumet Avenue is something that's added later. When you think of the west shore of George Lake, push it over towards Sheffield, and then Wolf Lake's on the other side. Wow, I think I can get through this, Mike, but I got to watch my time here. So what is it when you're looking at protecting these lakes? What is it that protects them? Well, the best way to protect them is with the Clean Water Act. And what is the Clean Water Act? Well, the Clean Water Act is the federal law that protects these bodies of water. Anyone who wants to discharge into a body of water must have a permit, a National Discharge Elimination Permit, NPDES permit. And that permit, the law is actually a federal law. It was Nixon had the Federal Clean Water Act, one of his achievements. And the idea is that no one can discharge into our environment. So again, you have to take this image of these bodies of water are all protected. They're not to be used by individuals. If they are to be used by individuals, it has to be for the greater good of the public, right? So if you are issuing a permit, you are allowing someone to contaminate your environment. I mean, that's how it works, right? I'm permitting you, I'm giving you a permit and saying, go ahead and discharge something. Now, in many cases, that is innocuous. It's nothing. It's just stormwater or rainwater. In other cases, especially when you have industrial processes that are exposed to that water, it may be something like those of you familiar with BP's permit into Lake Michigan. For years, there was that discussion over whether they could discharge salt. Why was that important? Well, they were getting ships from Nigeria and from Africa, and on their way over, they'd get salt water in the oil. And those of you who know, it's very, very difficult to remove salt. So they would have to figure out how to do it, and they were asking for mixing zones and so forth. And so there are certain chemicals that go into all these industrial permits, and some of them by design and some others by accident. But again, the idea of the Clean Water Act is you are permitting someone to do that. You are allowing them to discharge. The Clean Water Act has other things that, quite frankly, depending on how you look at it, we've pretty much ignored with this area, which is it allows for planning of watersheds. It allows for a comprehensive look at a watershed. It doesn't make much sense to deal with one permit, to deal with one facility. It's kind of like, the boy putting his finger in a dike. If he's putting it in here and there are 5 holes that are leaking like crazy, it's not going to do any good. That's something that seems to be just missing completely. Although there is, I guess, well, the remedial action plan, we'll talk about that in a minute. It gets the Clean Water Act is also, its very basic tenet of the Clean Water Act is public participation. So the idea is that again, you are permitting someone, you are allowing them to contaminate something, you're allowing them to use your water resources. And so it's not something that's done privately. It is something that's done public. It's done with something for that the public should know about. And in terms of planning, I would just point out that it more or less part of the Clean Water Act, but more of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is this idea of a remedial action plan. I told Mike I found out a few months ago that apparently this remedial action plan that IDEM has been developing is developing one because it's the area is concerned is now including Wolf Lake and George Lake. As far as I know, the guy who runs that has never been to a meeting, never spoken to anybody about this. They have an advisory committee. It's a citizens advisory committee with no citizens on it. So apparently that must be our water quality agreement planning process, Mike. I've not heard anything, but I keep finding maps with it on there. So what can you do with the Clean Water Act? Well, the Clean Water Act has also got some really strong tenets that can be used. For example, if someone violates their permit, it has to be usually disclosed to the state. And I should point out, if I've skipped that the Federal Clean Water Act is all 50 states, and that's US EPA. But part of that Clean Water Act is to delegate that program to the state. Always pushing to have the state handle these matters. The law is written that way. It's written that at the end of the day, in our case, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, they're the ones who should be handling all these water issues, and that eventually US EPA will have such a wonderful network of state enforcement and state regulations that it won't need itself anymore. Of course, that doesn't happen. I won't be too harsh on the state of Indiana, but the state of Indiana just doesn't do it. They just, as we'll see when we look at these individual cases in our watershed, they're just not enforcing it in many cases. And maybe I don't think it's malice. I don't know what it is. It just might be inattention. It might be that, I've had many conversations with people from the state of Indiana over the years, and they pretty much say, look, it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't have to do it. No one's going to, we just don't. The answer is no, we won't get it done. So as part of the Clean Water Act, though, public involvement is centered to this. For example, every permit that's issued should have public notice. We'll talk about that, Mike, and I know that that's not always the case, but every permit should be public notice. There is a wonderful, if you sign up for it, IDEM will send you notices on a daily or every other day basis and telling you what's going on in your neighborhood, who's been applying in Lake County for these permits. And I would highly recommend that everyone open those documents up and read them and see what it is they're doing. And if you don't like it, you have the right to challenge that permit. That is absolute fundamental portion of the Clean Water Act. If one of these companies violates this permit, the Clean Water Act, as most federal environmental statutes, also has a wonderful provision that says you as a citizen can stand in the shoes of the state or the federal government and you can file a lawsuit. Now, I think it says attorney, and I explained to Mike, my title there says attorney because I use this a lot for court, and I didn't know how to take that off of there. So I am an attorney. But the nice thing about citizen suits, twofold. One, you get to control it. Absolutely. And two, attorneys get their fees paid, which is always a good thing. But you can actually settle things out. I mean, you can actually bring a lawsuit against someone that you believe has violated the Clean Water Act. It does take a little bit of work because you'll have to prove your case. You simply can't send a notice out and saying, well, I'm going to sue you. And then they say, go ahead. And then you bluff. You don't want to do that. But the Clean Water Act is got citizen supervisions, which are very powerful. In addition, other resources that I thought would be important are IDEM's virtual file cabinet is also wonderful. It's very hard to negotiate or to figure out, but once you get the hang of it, you can actually look up many documents that come through the state of Indiana are available there. It's not easy to use. You got to figure out the facility name, and they usually skip things. And then I would suggest that some things that they don't want listed, they will not list. But they are that information is there. So those of you who are curious about, for example, is the company polluting? How are they doing on that permit that we've allowed them to discharge? Virtually all permits have reporting requirements, and those are available on IDEM's virtual file cabinet. In addition, the state and federal government both have very powerful freedom of information requests. So you can send to the state or federal government a request and say, I want to know what's going on. I want to know what's happening with this permit or this enforcement action, or, you know, what's happening with my neighborhood, what's happening with these water resources. Well, to do that, you file a federal or state FOIA request. It works okay. I just had a terrible, horrible experience with IDEM, who just refused to answer it, just said, we're too busy. And the federal government, who put me through a whole bunch of hoops and has told me they think that the employee that has the records took them home and then quit, which I find to be impossible, but that's already elevated. I'm talking with some people in Washington now, and it's a simple request. It was about one of the facilities tonight, and I got them to actually waive any fee because I said I was speaking tonight, and then they completely lost the documents and can't find them. And then I also would point out, when we're talking about the law, and a very interesting or distressing law is that Wolf Lake and George Lake are not public freshwater lakes. That is, if you look under the state of Indiana's law, and this is really the Natural Resources Commission, not IDEM, but if you were to look under Indiana law and say, what is a public freshwater lake? It would say public freshwater lakes are all lakes except for Lake Michigan, which is treated differently, but a lake lying wholly or in part within the corporate boundaries of any of the 3 cities having the largest population in a county having a population of more than 400,000 or less than 300 or 300,000. In other words, this is the thing that the city of Hammond uses a lot to say that laws are unfair in Indiana, that they're singling out Northwest Indiana. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. For example, the election of judges as opposed to the appointment of judges. And that's what this is. So those of you, I find it amazing still that law has never been changed. But if you look up under public freshwater lakes, we're not. So a lot of the policy, if you will, to protect our lakes is lost because we are not a public freshwater lake. I think that should be changed. But all right, so let's talk about a few of the issues that Mike wanted to talk about. A little bit of time there. So Mike gave me some idea of the facilities he wanted me to take a look at. The first one was Polyjohn. Hopefully everyone knows what's happened there. Polyjohn was discharging plastic materials. It's called pellets by some people. It is called, there's some other stuff that they actually use. It's roto something. It's like almost like sand. And yes, they discharged that material into George Lake in large quantities. And right now, I got to tell you, I've looked it up. I tried to figure out what's going on. The material is still there. It was removed a little bit at the start. They had some emergency removal there. But for the most part, it's there and it is existing in the environment. It's migrating from that spot. It's never been contained. Whoever put the containment booms up there used ones for oil, which were then destroyed and actually contaminated the lake more than what they had stopped. They never stopped it. What is interesting, though, is that the state of Indiana, after assessing a fine against this company, so they're discharging, they had no permit, right? They had no authority to discharge into that lake. They told the state that they didn't discharge the lake, so the state ignored them. And then when people started reporting these discharges, they started responding. But it would also look like there's a national permit or a general permit that could be given to a company that operates next to a body of water. And it's pretty simple. It just says it's a general permit, which means that the parameters are the same for every facility that applies for this permit. And the permits themselves pretty much say, as long as you're cleaning a house and as long as you think about not polluting the environment, there's really not much in the way of sampling. So in that case, they do have a permit now. It's a general permit. But as for the cleanup, as for the rest of that, the material is still there. It's still degrading. It will be a forever chemical because as it breaks down, it just gets smaller and smaller. That's the issue that keeps coming up at the Federated Metals meetings. Our local activist keeps raising that issue. I don't think it could be addressed through Federated Metals. I know there were samples taken in that wetland that they've contaminated for lead and it didn't show up. It was well under the 400 parts per million standard. But quite frankly, I'm just shocked that nothing has happened. The material is still there. It's never been cleaned up and it seems to be migrating off-site. So that's that one. And then there was another one that is not, I don't think, very good, which is that the on the southern end of George Lake. So if we include all of George Lake, down here, there was those of you who drive down Calumet Avenue probably don't realize that what you're looking at when you get just before the toll road is you're looking at the southern reaches of George Lake. US EPA went to rename that part of the lake. I've asked them to change that. I don't think it's appropriate to walk into somebody's neighborhood and start changing the names of their lakes. And I also point out that they always call it Lake George when it's always been George Lake. Lake George is in Hobart, George Lake is in Hammond. And that one is I think a very bad occurrence that happened there. If you've been following it in the newspaper, it made the front page of the newspaper that US EPA decided, apparently without asking anyone, that there is a contamination on the bottom of the canal down there, which again would probably be the bottom of George Lake, right? I mean, because we're talking about that was the original outlet of the lake. A lot of it's been filled, a lot of it hasn't. So that's an original body of water. Where it was dredged, they found that there were high levels of contaminants in the bottom of the canal. And rather than remove it, as I would think the public would have asked for, they pretty much went without any public comment and then decided the best thing to do is to cap it. The issue is over now. It'd be impossible to undo that. But what you have is you have an underwater hazardous waste facility. And this is one of the ones that I got involved with. I filed an objection to give you, and not to dissuade you from exercising your rights under the Clean Water Act, but in that case, it was terrible. They got, a 4-page letter of objection. They at first said they never got it, making me think I understood the term gaslighting after this. They said they never got it. I found out after all of that they did get it and didn't know how to respond to it. So they went ahead and permitted this anyway. And when I asked why it was that they didn't remove the waste, why they just capped it, I was told that it was cost concerns and that the responsible party maybe couldn't afford to remove the waste. And it turned out it was BP. And right after they said that, BP announced its record profit. So I think they could have removed the waste. But I think that's a bad stroke. I think that hopefully we are all vigilant. And when they propose to move, and by the way, a large part of that was in the city of Hammond, and the Corps of Engineers said they made one phone call to the city of Hammond. They thought that was sufficient, and that they said they didn't have any problem with it. And the one person was enough for them. And then they said they spoke at the Chamber of Commerce luncheon, and that was enough public notice to tell these residents of Hammond that they were going to be stuck with this hazardous waste buried under their water body. But that one's pretty much done, but they'll be moving farther along the canal to the west. And I would encourage everyone to oppose the idea of just contaminated materials, lots of petroleum waste, and just encapsulating it and leaving it there. Whereas one of the gentlemen from US EPA or the Corps of Engineers pretty much said, yeah, it's going to leak. It's not going anywhere. I mean, it's going to eventually just degrade or seep out. It's not going to be a permanent cure for it. The permanent cure would have been to remove it, but now we're stuck with it. And then Mike asked me to talk about Wolf Lake terminals. He and I have a long history with that one. There again, I objected to the issuance of a permit. And what happened there was that the state, if you want to see where the Clean Water Act has problems in Indiana, take a look at Wolf Lake terminals. There was no question Wolf Lake terminals, that the issuance of that permit was incorrect. It was also clear that they had not contacted anyone. If you looked at the application that had been submitted, it claimed there were a bunch of people had been notified. Michael was on there. I was on there. I went and got affidavits from most of those people saying, no, we had no idea this happened. And in that case, that I still think is a problem, because what happened in that case was that the argument was that it was an inappropriate permit. That a permit that's a general permit for a facility where they transfer petroleum back and forth from cars to rail cars is far different than the facility that's adjacent to Wolf Lake. That is a facility that deals with petroleum, it deals with hazardous waste, it deals with all kinds of chemicals. And quite frankly, some of the things I saw that were pretty shoddy. I saw railroad cars being drained right on the ground. And at one time, there was actually a second outfall that everybody seemed to have missed. And so I've been filing objections to those, and we got a really nice decision that said, yeah, you're right. This is not right. They didn't give out notice to anyone. And there are some questions on it. But the problem with that, and Mike wanted to know why that has kind of stalled out, is that these permits are good for 5 years. And unless it's renewed, your permit stays. It isn't like you don't have a permit. You have the oldest permit. And what happened there is they said, okay, so you're not getting the new permit, but you've got your old permit, and that's good enough for us. But I think I think that turned out to be a great example, is to see how hard IDEM was willing to fight citizens who had questions, as opposed to going back to the industry and saying, hey, you might want to just correct some of these problems that the public is raising. For example, the use of water treatment chemicals. In Discovery, they pretty much admitted they used them, and for that you need a special permit because you are discharging to Lake Michigan, and the state just, I don't know, they just ignored our questions and our concerns. They also, when we raised the issue of contamination or use of hazardous waste, they pretty much claimed they did nothing about it. The decision, by the way, came out on 1/9/23. I find it odd that on December 21st of 22, so less than a month earlier, the state of Indiana had issued an agreed order to the same company. What for? For mishandling hazardous waste. And to give you an idea, again, of this disconnect between the state and, I think, local environmentalists or people of the community are concerned about their environment. I told Mike I found this really odd, that in lieu of paying their penalty, they wanted them to send money not to Wolf Lake, not to help the local environment, but they wanted them to send it to a project that they had in mind in Gary. So a real disconnect between the state agencies and, I think, local community. I don't know, Mike. I'll defer to you. You said half an hour. I'm at 35, and I'll keep going. I did want to show you one last thing, because those of you who are friends of Wolf Lake, I think this is probably the oldest picture of Wolf Lake you're ever going to see. It's a copy, and this is Sheffield. At one time, the south end of Wolf Lake was called Sheffield. It was not called Robertsdale. It was Sheffield. And what's cool about this is this has to be right after. So one of the issues that we didn't get into is whether or not the lake was navigable at the time the state of Indiana was incorporated, and whether or not that makes these bodies of water protected as public resources without regard to any even state statute. And if you look carefully, you'll see there's a water tower here. And the water tower was probably used to provide water for a steamboat that was owned by Jacob Forsyth. So this has got to be a pretty old photograph, because one, it calls it Sheffield, not anything else. And two, it's got that water tower back there. And the water tower is important because after the Chicago fire of 1871, Jacob Forsyth made money by supplying timber to Chicago. And he did it with a steamboat on Wolf Lake. So he went down and cut a lot of the trees close to the water's edge and then would ship them to Chicago. So this is important, not because it's just kind of a cool old picture, but because the issue of navigability is one that addresses these lakes. How well you protect the body of water is sometimes decided on whether or not it was considered navigable. And it gets very complicated because there are written decisions about Wolf Lake in the law books that say Wolf Lake is not navigable. But navigability, the definition of navigability changes over time. I don't think there's any question that it's a navigable lake today. I mean, there are boats on it. So George Lake, we don't know. But George Lake is navigable in a different sense. Navigability also means its use in interstate commerce. So I think we're okay there. I think all these lakes should be preserved and they should be saved. Now, what would you like to know, Mike? I think you're on mute. I think you're still on mute. You got to click the little microphone. There you go.
Okay, I'm no longer on mute. So we're open for questions. If anybody have a question they've been seeking to ask.
Yeah, but this is Mike. Dave, can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah, I heard your presentation a few months ago too, and then a lot of these issues were new to me. I'm relatively new to the Ollie group. When I hear all these issues, and some of these seem insurmountable, and they're being ignored by the major polluters, and they're being ignored by our government officials. Have you in your mind some ideal plan that, okay, the best way to help clean up this area, is it through the media? Is it through community groups? Is it through lawsuits? Is it through political activism? Is there in your mind some type of action plan where over time, with small steps along the way, you could reach some of the major outcomes that you'd like to see?
Well, I would point out that we
Something like
have
that?
we have, I mean, the group OLLI,
Mhm.
the United Citizens Association, when it decides to meet, we are effective, but I will never say it's insurmountable, but I would say that it requires a heightened level of attention. We just can't, I mean, and that's unfortunate. And I don't know how we change that mindset, but I think groups that meet, maybe pressure on the state, pressure certainly on our state rep and our state senator, who seem to be very interested in environmental issues. Now with Federated Metals coming to the fore, you've got government's ear, but I don't know how you overcome all this history of, I want to say, I mean, dealing with Northwest Indiana in the state of Indiana, whether it's education or crime or whatever, we always seem to be on the outs. We always seem to be getting the short end of the stick. And here we are with an issue that really pertains to us. We have so much industry. Our environment is so degraded. We should have lots of attention towards it. So I think it's a combination of all those things. I think it's, organizations like OWLI that are meeting and discussing it. I think there's certainly a role for lawsuits if need be. I would tell you that I filed a notice to file a lawsuit against Polyjohn. State of Indiana, with my 1 day to go, filed on top of me, so I couldn't file, although I could argue I could have, and actually sued the wrong company, and then settled the whole thing for like a few $100s. So I'd like to do some more of that. I think it's a combination of things, though. I wish I could tell you there was some solution, but I don't think there's anything that's that quick. Persistence.
I have a question. The business about the Indiana Harbor, the canal coming into George Lake, and you said they capped it to a certain point, but there's more to be capped?
Yes.
Moving towards Calumet Avenue, where it kind of ends?
Yes, the next section should be all entirely in Hammond, and they've promised me, as sort of a consolation. Yeah, we didn't. I mean, the idea of when someone files an objection to a permit, they are legally required to respond, right?
Mhm.
And what they did was very interesting, because I did get some of the information. First, they sent me a long letter, but then they put it in a file and didn't send it back because they didn't know how to answer it. And then the state just ignored it. But yes, absolutely, the next segment that will be addressed will be wholly in the city of Hammond.
And do you have any idea of what the hazardous materials are that they're capping down there?
Petroleum waste.
That's
It's hydrocarbons. It's the stuff that came out, is seeped out of the J&L site. The J&L site is, remember when you go down Calumet Avenue, if you look to your east, that's not a ditch that was constructed. That's a lake that wasn't filled in. That's the opposite. So that's original lake bottom. Everything to the east of there was filled in at first with steel mill waste. And then on top of that, they dump things that, I have a wonderful article from the 70s where the head of that time, Amoco, says, we don't even know what we created and dumped over there. So it's petroleum waste, but it's BP. They do a very good job of addressing it. There is a permit, again, for that site in itself. When the permit is issued for Lake Michigan, there's a permit that's issued for them. They have an active discharge there where that material is drained. But again, you have a conscientious company that I'm certain is keeping an eye on it. But what happened there? Yeah, it's material from there. It's a lot of petroleum waste.
And then why isn't that going into that containment that's sitting there? What goes into that, that containment that they built on Indianapolis and the canal?
See, wouldn't that have been a great question to ask them?
Okay.
I asked, they ignored it. They told me they didn't get my request, and then they said, well, we did get it, but we forgot about it, so sorry.
What does go into that containment? Do you know?
Sure, it's the dredgings from the navigable waters. That containment area is made so they can get boats in and out of the Inner Ship Canal. Not that many years ago, the ships were actually, it was almost like pushing big, like pudding almost in that. So that's to keep the navigable waters clean and clear, not clean and clear, not clean by any means. But that's the
Yeah.
dredgings from what goes out into Lake Michigan. If you've ever seen the aerial views and it looks like this big plume coming out of there, the idea is to put all that in there.
So
And
that's
again, they could have taken, but see, they could have taken the material that they buried, and they didn't.
Yeah.
I agree with you. That's what they should have done.
Okay. Thank you.
Valerie, you look sad.
Well, just so many obstacles and laws that should be beneficial. But it's just depressing to hear about people losing the correspondence or forgetting about it or things like that. I know we have to keep trying.
Oh, and I think I forgot, you mentioned there's another law that's very important, which is the protection of wetlands. And boy, I hope I haven't depressed anybody tonight, because this one's bad, which is that hopefully everyone knows that the U.S. Supreme Court has decided that wetlands, unless they are right next to a lake, are pretty much not going to be regulated. Fortunately, ours are next to a lake. But the way that works is there's a 404 permit that comes from the federal government. And in each case where a water body is going to be affected, not with an NPDES permit, it's a 401 water quality certification that comes from the state. So there again, you have the right to object, you have the right to comment on those when it's just addressing wetlands. So not only is it discharging waste into a water body, but anything that wants to fill a body of water, anything that wants to destroy a wetland has to go through those. However, there are exceptions. The exceptions are general permits, which are abused, I think. And then if you want to, you can do what some people do, which is just fill it with a little bit over time, and eventually there's no more wetland. And you say, well, I didn't discharge that. It was just over time, you know. But I'm sorry, that was just another area of the law that you can find out about if someone proposes to destroy wetlands, which I hope in this day and age, we're not destroying any more wetlands in Northwest Indiana. We've destroyed so many of them. We don't have much left.
Yeah. That rubber stuff from Polyjon, is the suspicion that that's killing the swans?
No,
Okay.
I think what suspicion is killing the swans are parasites.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely. And anything, I think it is irresponsible for anyone to come forward and to say that lead is killing them, or the great green cloud monster, or whatever people have been alleged. All the studies that I've seen all say parasites. And it is very common for especially mute swans to be susceptible to parasites. Now, who knows what's killing? Now, recently, those ducks that have been dying up there, that causes some concern. That might be avian flu. But the suggestion that lead is a chronic problem. It's not something like you swallow like a lead sinker and you die. And while those birds have lead in them, so do many waterfowl, especially those who are in industrial areas or those who feed where there's been a lot of duck hunting, and we have both of those. But I think it's irresponsible for the state not to come forward and tell us what's killing those swans. They know it's parasites, but again, they told me, I kind of pushed them on this and said, why don't you tell the public what you know to allay their fears? So they're not sitting there thinking that the lead monster of George Lake is out killing things. And they just said, no, no, it's all right. We're not going to do it. So what you have is you have people speculating and saying, oh, it's lead, it's federated metals. No proof to that. Some guy went to some meeting. He said he could cut open the swan and he could see the lead. I don't know what that was. I mean, there's no way you can do that. But there is no official who's willing to step forward and say, no, I'm in control. Here's what happened, folks. Don't worry. We have other problems to worry about, but you are not going to get killed by ingesting lead, or I don't know how you would get it in you. So no, I think it's parasites. That's all the studies I've seen said parasites.
Okay. Is the state the only people looking at it, or is anybody from the universities, doing any of the independent research on it?
I think there's some folks that are organized, that we're sending it to some vet or something. I mean, but again, you have a state biologist. I've spoken to her. She's looked at them. She said, yeah, it's parasites. It's very common, especially for mute swans. They're
But-
susceptible, but
she won't say that publicly because she's afraid she doesn't have all the data. You know, she's hedging her bet. Or
I think it's probably, why would you want to endure all of those phone calls from all of those angry people from Whiting-Robertsdale wanting more information? It's just easier to do nothing. There's no one telling you to do it. So,
yeah.
and we don't have anybody locally who takes that mantle. So we just ignore it. And what you're stuck with is a lot of rumors and a lot of people who are worried, who believe something that's, I would submit, is not true, which is that it's probably parasites and the avian flu or something. It's not. The only way lead is going to kill a duck quickly is if you shoot it with it, and that's not what's happening.
I have a question. Are there any newspapers that are interested in these problems there in Hammond or
No,
any of the? No.
not really. I mean, we get articles, but it doesn't. It's for local consumption, and if it doesn't move people, it doesn't work. And then you run the real risk of having somebody like the Chicago Tribune who writes an article, and what are they going to do? They're going to write your neighborhood is contaminated and the lead is killing your birds, and that does nothing to promote your community. So what you've done is you've gotten bad attention, and it hasn't moved the ball forward, right? I mean, I think maybe pressure on state representatives, state senators would make more sense in that way. Because we got plenty of bad stories about Northwest Indiana. I don't think there's a value to getting new ones.
Mhm. Thanks. All right, but then you have suggested something, which is just making sure that the state senators and representatives are really apprised of the problem.
Absolutely. We had a meeting last year. Unfortunately, it was held on a Friday night of all things. And we did get the ear of the state senator and the state rep. And, they did try. They didn't succeed, but they did try. And I think they're our voice in Indianapolis. And they're willing to work with us. So absolutely.
Okay, so I guess my next question is, Michael, who is there some contact that Owley has, a regular contact with the state rep and state senator in Indiana?
Yeah, I've been working mostly with the state rep, but she's very good and very responsive, and so I have faith in her. And we get her out to the lake every once in a while, and I think she truly enjoys that. I think.
Who is that?
I'm trying to think of the name. You remember?
Is it Carolyn Jackson?
Sounds familiar.
Yes.
Yes, it is Carolyn Jackson. And I think she at one time was a Chicago cop before she moved to Indiana. Oh, she has some of that background as well, I think.
Well, my question is, will this presentation be available to share with others like normally, or?
Like normally, it'll be on our website.
Okay, so it's a presentation we can share with people here on the Illinois side, or,
If you want to share something with the Illinois side, you share Wolf Lake Terminals. The discharge for Wolf Lake Terminals discharges into Illinois. And I had a conversation with someone from the state of Indiana, and we were talking about the appropriateness of that discharge. And I said, well, you do know it discharges in Illinois. And she cut the phone call short, and she said, well, then what do I care? Because the discharge actually is on the fence line. And I have again, I wish I had the graphics. I have a videotape of a big brown plume coming out of there during a rainstorm. It was just pouring out and just making that area where the duck hunters are, just this big brown, like I said, plume into the lake. But yeah, that it would be great if we got some folks from Illinois just to say, no, you know, we can do better.
Yeah. It's a slightly different. Oh, go ahead.
That is Robin Kelly as a federal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
rep
she's
there?
been very helpful.
Oh, okay.
When we originally looked at something in Illinois, because of the discharge, her staff was very helpful.
Oh, good. Thanks. Thanks.
Do you have, this is just a touch tangential, do you have any sense of this hydrogen hub that they're talking about and where it's going to go if it happens?
Not a clue.
Okay, other questions? I'm going to let him off that easily.
Yeah.
An attorney? Oh my God.
I'd rather talk about the history. Now that's really my joy, is to talk about the history of Wolf Lake is just fascinating. I mean, the idea that I'm not kidding, that story about the name of Wolf Lake and why it's so important is an amazing story, because it was to be destroyed, and there were forces that really wanted it destroyed and wanted it destroyed quickly before anybody would notice. Both George Lake and Wolf Lake were destroyed over a very quick period of time, because no one saw their value, or you had people who were desperate for money, who thought they were going to make a lot of money by filling it in quickly and getting a steel mill, and it never worked out.
And when was this? Like what year?
The steel mill in Hammond is the early teens, I believe, or maybe early 20s. You know what? You can get a copy of that book I wrote. It's in there.
Oh,
Go to
okay,
the
okay.
chamber. I put quite a bit in there.
Okay.
The one in Hammond was interesting, because in that one with George Lake, the state of Indiana showed up and said, no, this is a public piece of property. You can't just fill it in and give it to a steel mill. And the officials from the city of Hammond were so desperate for money, because they had no steel mill. They had no oil refinery. They didn't have any major industry. And they thought this was going to be their savior. So, I mean, there's wonderful quotes from them saying, you know, it's good for nothing but mosquitoes. And it was this beautiful wetland property, and they just fill it as fast as you can. And they did. They filled it, like I said, it was 24 hours a day, trucks from slag coming from the steel mills to dump the slag there. That's how they filled it in. It was a shallow lake. Same with the south end of Wolf Lake. You know, it was all filled with slag, and it was filled even when the people trying to save the lake said, stop, you know, don't do that. They just kept doing it. I mean, they just filled it as fast as they could. And of course, there's no federal regulations or state regulations back then. All you had was the public trust doctrine. And you did have at that point, and there's a quote somewhere saying from like the state of Indiana saying they were so disgusted with how it was handled, they'll never come back. And maybe that's why they stopped coming up to see us. You know, that was back in the, I want to say that's in the 1920s. But they pretty much said, look, you guys up here, you know, we're trying to save this piece of lake, this piece of property, this lake, and you guys are working against this. So have at it. We're leaving. We're never coming back.
And that you said that was the state of Indiana?
That's the state of Indiana. Yeah. That's when they argued that George Lake was public property because it was a lake and it was owned by the state. And the city of Hammond primarily argued, no, fill the thing in as fast as you can, because we need the money and we want that steel. They were going to get a steel mill that rivaled U.S. Steel. That was the Schlesinger Steel interest that we're going to build there. And if you go to the Hammond Public Library, I think they even have these fanciful maps that they had drawn up showing the steel mill and showing all the new housing, and it was going to be this massive port. And that's why, again, if you look, it's called the J&L site, which is the successor to Schlesinger. But yeah, I mean, you have to look at, if you stand back and you look at these as natural bodies of water that have been abused over the years, you know, these were much larger bodies of water. So what we're preserving and saving now are remnants. We're not saving natural bodies of water, certainly not on the Wolf Lake side. I mean, I'd be hard pressed to find any acre there that wasn't dredged or changed at some point.
So then is that the origin of Indianapolis just forgetting about us?
Oh, I don't know. I think they just don't like us. I think,
Well, I keep,
I
you know,
mean-
I keep hearing stuff like that and I'm not sure what that means or, you know, like why?
I, as a kid, and I found this just the other day, I got to teach at the university at IU, and my course was on Northwest Indiana. And the reason the university thought it was a good idea is they had no idea why Northwest Indiana was so disliked. So if they didn't know, I don't think we ever found out. I think my class was, but yeah, I actually taught a class in that years ago, and I mean, I can go into. This is not the history hour, but
Right, no, I
you have
understand.
you have
There's no
minority
simple-
populations, you have Eastern Europeans, you have Catholics, you have people who are interested in labor unions. The rest of the state of Indiana, you can see how much I like them. What do they have? Well, they've got the Klan, right? I mean, Indiana was one of the staunchest followers of the Klan.
Right,
And granted, it's not the Klan it's not the 1870s Klan, it's the 1920s Klan, which was America first. Who were they against? They didn't like Catholics, they didn't like Eastern Europeans, and they were staunch promoters of prohibition. Northwest Indiana is the complete opposite of that. So maybe that's where it starts.
Thank God.
I'm a little curious to hear more about the history of Calumet College in relation to the lakes. You mentioned something from the 1970s, but I wasn't quite clear what that was. Could you elaborate a little bit?
Well, Calumet College was located in East Chicago, and they were when Standard Oil had built those labs, which is now where Calumet College is, and it extended all the way from the building that's there now all the way down south, where they had greenhouses to test bugs. I mean, it was an amazing facility. It was world-class laboratory, and they wanted to get rid of it in part because they claimed that they couldn't get the kind of people they wanted to work, didn't want to commute to Whiting, so they built a new lab in Naperville where they wanted to move. So they had to get rid of those buildings. And the way they did it was they decided they would donate it to Calumet College. But as part of that, they didn't have enough money to do what they wanted with those buildings. So as part of it, this is my view of it, Calumet College insisted that they also give them the lake, George Lake. Their proposal was, then Calumet College said, we'll make a fortune off of this. Their proposal was to first sand mine that lake to a depth of at least 20 or 30 feet, get all the sand out of it, get down to clay, and then fill it with garbage. It would have been a sanitary landfill, much like you see on the south side of Chicago. Same companies involved, all the ones that Waste Management, a lot of the officials went to jail after that. And it really destroyed, well, I shouldn't say destroyed, really put a huge strain on the neighborhood. You had those that wanted to save the lake, hence my bumper sticker if you've ever seen it. And then you had those that thought it was wrong to fight because in this case, it was priests that were promoting this. Father McCabe, Father Schimmel, and it was really a nasty argument. And it existed until, and remember, Calumet College never sold the lake to the city of Hammond. Calumet College sold out and sold it to a private developer, and the city of Hammond bought it from that developer. So at the end of the day, yeah, Calumet College proposed to destroy it, and that's when I got started in this kind of stuff. But it was not pretty.
Oh, well, thank you. That was
Sorry.
sad, but informative. Yeah.
It was a very tough fight. It caused a lot of people to leave. It caused a lot of angst. It caused a lot of division that I think, well, most of those people have passed away, but a lot of people, you know, they wouldn't talk to their neighbors. And you had people saying, how dare you challenge the church? These are people who were very, very, very religious and had believed in the church their entire lives. And then the church turned around. I remember being there and one of the priests saying, you know, you guys live in Cracker Jack box houses and you know nothing. We are going to educate you. But I think we educated them at the end of the day.
I thank you for the suggestion. Hi, guys.
And just, if she's on a call. Yeah.
We were just chatting.
Other questions? Well, David, I I think we run out of questions. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I'm just gonna see all of you on the 21st. We're gonna go out into the woods and read poetry. It's a fantastic event. It's
That's right.
free. I guarantee you will enjoy yourself.
Where are you meeting?
The Lost Marsh Clubhouse. Make sure it's at 7. It should be at 7. We always meet at 7, but if you want to check with me just before the 21st. It's the darkest evening of the year. We're going to read Robert Frost in the woods. We've done it for years. It's a wonderful experience. It's free. You'll meet new people. You'll have a great time. We'll discuss poetry. How often do you get a chance to do that, right?
Especially in that setting.
In the woods. We're stopping by the woods on a snowy evening. It's the darkest evening of the year. Not kidding. The Chicago Tribune did a wonderful story about it years ago, and we ended up being like a national attention for this thing. But it is a great time. Free, calming, right before Christmas when your nerves are shot. You're gonna go in the woods with a bunch of fun people and read poetry. What more can there be?
Sounds great.
Sounds great.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to